Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Algonquin Public Library's Chapter by Chapter program, a teen-friendly story time and also digital picture book experience. For the month of October, we are going to be reading a book called In the Hall with the Knife by Diana Peterfreund. We are reading with permissions from Abraham's Children's Books. And we are going to be doing, instead of a video series where you just watch me read out loud, I have got my VolunTeens group to help create art for this story. So I hope that you enjoy the art that they have created, and we're going to keep this going next year. So if you're interested in providing art and earning volunteer hours, please feel free to email me. My name is Lindsay, and I am the teen librarian. So we're going to get started with our first video for In the Hall with the Knife, and we'll just get started and going. So chapter 1 is Orchid's point of view. The office of the headmaster of Blackbrook Academy looked like a high-budget, if not particularly imaginative, movie set. Glossy wood paneling shimmered with the polish of a century, and leather-bound volumes of old yearbooks stood in rows as a testament to all the scholarly glory that had come before. As Orchid McKee entered, her gaze landed on the gilded wooden engravings of the school's crest mounted right above the headmaster body's door. To make men of knowledge and integrity. Naturally, they never changed it after the school went co-ed. She wondered what they planned to do with the women. The hard-backed wooden chairs lined up along the wall outside his door seemed crafted to be the most uncomfortable seats imaginable, the better to impress upon the occupants that they were in trouble and they'd better get used to squirming. There was already a student sitting in one. Orchid perched on the very edge of another. She wasn't in trouble, and she hadn't squirmed in years. Of that she was sure. Orchid had crafted her entire existence at Blackbrook to make sure that she would never be noticed for anything. The oversized hooded sweatshirts, the mousy brown hair, the glasses and the headphones, and the ever-present fat book, all were perfectly crafted costume to say one single thing: boring. Her homework was always meticulously done and turned in early, if she could manage it at all. She didn't party and sneak off campus to drink in the woods near the ravine. She'd never even gotten dragged into the usual dorm room drama, though it probably helped that she also paid the private room premium on her boarding bill ever since freshman year. Orchid liked her privacy, which was why when the person seated next to her nudged her elbow and asked, "What you in for, McKee?" she just shrugged and returned to her book, letting her two long bangs fall over her face. You could deflect quite a lot of conversation with a simple shrug. Orchid had been perfecting hers for decades. But Phineas Plum, seated in the hardback chair beside her, wasn't much for going unnoticed. If you were making the Lux boarding school movie, you couldn't have cast the part of the hipster nerd any better. Cute, and boy did he know it. Smart, and he made sure everyone knew that part too. At a school like Blackbrook, the resident genius enjoyed all the popularity of other schools' star quarterbacks or head cheerleaders. "I don't know either," he barreled on, as if Orchid had invited conversation. "Though I guess since it's the middle of junior year, it might have something to do with academic honor societies." Possibly. Orchid's grades were excellent, and everyone at school knew that Finn was the best student in the class. "Though I don't see Scarlet," he added. "Make that the best male student." Scarlet Mystery lived down the hall from Orchid and, curiously, always seemed to have insider knowledge on every student's academic ranking, which she'd regularly announce to any person within spitting distance. She was also the class president, the head of the campus beautification committee, and, in Orchid's opinion, a complete pain in the butt. Orchid hadn't moved to Maine to get mired in the same competitive mean girl drama that had devoured so many of the young women she'd known back in California. It's not like Orchid kept up with the news from back home, but some stories you couldn't avoid. The tabloids made sure of that. No, she had come to Maine to stay out of trouble, and the fact that Scarlet wasn't also sitting in the headmaster's office right now did not bode well for Finn's honor society theory. "Or maybe we screwed up," she suggested to him. He laughed weakly. Nah, she bet Finn could never imagine doing anything wrong at all. Not Blackbrook's golden boy, the scientific genius who would uphold the campus legacy of innovation. Half a century ago, Richard Thane, still a student at the school, had somehow stumbled upon a formula for some sort of mega powerful industrial glue, which had made him, and Blackbrook Academy, which shared the rights to the patent, millions. Not the most glamorous of inventions, glue. Not like a microchip. Orchid doubted anyone would actually make a big budget biopic about a glue inventor, but it still was enough to put the tiny boarding school on the map. For decades, it had been the premier destination for the dedicated science student. At least those who didn't mind the remote setting, out on the tip of a rocky peninsula so far into the wilderness of Maine, it was practically Greenland. They said if you came to Blackbrook, you were either a complete genius or hiding from something. Orchid preferred to let people think she was a genius. From behind the closed door to the headmaster's private chamber, there came a loud thump, followed by the murmur of raised voices. "You can't do this to me!" That was a girl's voice. Orchid and Finn exchanged glances. "Calm down," Headmaster Body was heard saying. More words shouted over one another. Orchid couldn't make out much until, "No! You will live to regret this. I'll make sure of that." The door flew open, and standing on the threshold, feet planted apart like she was some amazing, avenging Amazon, stood none other than the 6-foot-tall terror of the tennis court, Beth Peacock Peacatch. Well, that's what her friends called her. Orchid was never much for sports, but she thought the nickname was stupid. But Beth Peacatch had embraced it, as well as the cawing that ensued in the stands whenever her matches began. She'd even dyed the tips of her signature blonde ponytail a vibrant blue, a color which was currently contrasting furiously with her crimson cheeks. "Beth," Headmaster Body warned. Peacock looked at the two students sitting in the chairs and scowled. This was the stare that struck fear into the hearts of her opponents. Finn flinched. Orchid gaped. Peacock fled. Headmaster Body called to his secretary, then paused. "Oh, that's right. Mrs. O'Connor is proctoring the freshman bio exam, isn't she?" "I wouldn't know, sir," Finn replied. Suck up. In truth, most of the staff had packed up the second their last exams were finished and headed for the mainland to spend the break with their friends and family. It was always dead at Blackbrook over the holidays. Orchid knew that all too well. "All right," Headmaster Body said. "I'll take care of it later. Miss McKee, I believe you're next." She felt a sudden dread deep in the pit of her stomach. She didn't care for what Finn's theory was. No way were they being called in here to be informed one by one of some dubious academic honor. She'd screwed up. Somehow, despite all of her careful planning, she'd screwed up. "Good luck," Finn said to her as if they were friends. They were not friends. She shrugged again. Headmaster Body's private chamber was cozy, softer than the imperious presence of the office waiting room. Here there were the stern, frowning pictures of headmasters, always male, who had come before him, but there was also a merry fire burning in the grate and mismatched plaid cushions on the armchairs across from the great wooden desk. He swiped a heavy-looking brass candlestick from the rug, replaced it on the mantel, and chuckled ruefully. "Let's try to keep this civil, okay?" That must have been the object they heard thunking to the ground. Had Peacock actually thrown it? At Body? Knowing Peacock's serving arm, Orchid was shocked that the man had survived. Everyone loved the headmaster. He'd been at Blackbrook for more than a decade after a long career as a professor of chemical engineering at a college on the mainland. He liked cats and pipes and cheering for the school sports teams from the front row. A jolly old grandpa, at least as long as you stayed in line. For a moment, Orchid stopped wondering what she'd done wrong and started wondering what Peacock was in for. "Yes, sir." She closed the door and took a seat in one of the wingback chairs. "Now you." He shuffled through some papers. "Ah, yes, Miss McKee. We wanted to wait until you were finished with your exams so as not to disrupt the semester's academic record. But given that a situation has arisen, well, when was the last time you spoke to your parents?" "Oh, I speak to them a few times a week over the phone or email," she replied evenly. Cicely had called over Thanksgiving, ranting about her check, but Orchid had resolved that. The sperm donor, of course, she'd never even met. "It's just, there seems to be a problem with your last tuition payment. And when we tried to contact your parents in the Caymans, the number we have on file was disconnected." "I don't know how that could have happened, other than the number was a total fake. If I could call your parents now, maybe their cell phones, I'm sure we could resolve this. We wouldn't want a problem going into next semester." "Of course not," Orchid said, thinking fast. The only thing is, I think they're on safari in Kenya at the moment, so I don't even know if I can get them. Safari? Headmaster Body looked unimpressed, as if that were not the craziest thing he'd heard about this overprivileged students. Probably not the craziest even this week. Yeah, she pretended to consider options. Oh, I know. I can call our accountant. I'm sure she can tell me if there was a mix-up with the accounts. You know the number of your parents' personal accountant? Sure, she gave a rich girl shrug. That probably wasn't the craziest thing the headmaster had heard all week either. Then she called her accountant, the same one she'd had for over a decade, the only member of her original team left. Her accountant's secretary, unfortunately, was new and momentarily confused by the name Orchid McKee, which Orchid had to repeat entirely too many times for comfort in front of the headmaster. I'm sorry, the secretary said. She's out of the office today, but I can check on that transaction for you. Please enter your security PIN on the keypad. This was why Orchid kept them around. Their commitment to keeping their clients' privacy was exquisite. She entered a PIN. All automatic transactions for this client were canceled last month. Well, that explained why Cicely had been so upset. Orchid had thought that it was the woman's usual mismanagement of funds. That kind had almost cost Orchid $500,000 before she put her mother on an allowance. Why? The note says at the client's request. She'd requested nothing of the sort, but she wasn't about to get into it in front of the headmaster. After being assured that they'd get to the bottom of this as soon as possible, Orchid hung up and flashed a smile at Headmaster Body. Slight mix-up with the accounts. In the meantime, I'll just cover it. She dug into her bag for her checkbook and wrote out a tuition check. A big one. Black Book was not cheap. He stared at her. Miss McKee, surely you don't have the funds in your personal account to cover tuition. Students are just supposed to have spending money. And book fees, Orchid said, waving the check. Daddy made sure I had a little extra this month, because of the safari. Right. Headmaster Body hesitated another moment, then took the check. It still probably wasn't the craziest thing he'd heard all week. While I have you here, I must ask, why didn't you bother to enter your biology project into the state science fair? Oh, no. It was the best in the class. Your teacher and I were so disappointed. I know you don't need the scholarship, he gestured to her check, but the prestige of placing might be worth it, for your college applications, if nothing else. I'm not really one for competitions, said Orchid. Or publicity, she thought. I just want to focus on my classes. Headmaster Body considered this. Yes, I looked at your grades earlier. You are one of the top-ranked juniors in the school. She'd definitely heard Scarlett mentioning the fact on occasion. Ranks and awards and stuff just really aren't my thing. Stealth scholar. Her best role to date, introverted nerd. Tell you what, I'll think about that whole state fair thing next year. She checked her watch. Now, though, I do have to run home and finish my history term paper. She didn't, as she'd already completed it almost a week ago. It's amazing how smoothly the lies still fell from her lips, even after all this time. Headmaster Body sighed. Very well, send in my next appointment, Mr. Plum. She headed out. Finn stood when he saw her. My turn? She nodded. Good luck. He probably wasn't in trouble either, probably just being informed of the award status of his latest chemistry experiment, which of course he would be entering into all the competitions. The weather had turned from frigid to positively Arctic. They were supposed to get some ice overnight. Orchid pulled on her thick knit cap with the earmuffs, buttoned her long puffy coat up to her chin, and pulled up the fur-lined hood. Some kids couldn't make it through their first winter at Blackbrook. If the isolation didn't kill you, the freezing darkness would. But for Orchid, the benefits of the former far outweighed any issues she might have had with the latter. So what if the sun set soon after lunch, or it snowed from October to May? She was safe here, invisible. The sky was a wormy gray, and the wind whipped through the bare branches of the trees as Orchid hurried across campus. The windows in all the buildings were dark and empty, as most of the students and faculty had already left for the holiday. Orchid was struck with the sudden realization that she could scream at the top of her lungs and no one would hear her. Less a Lux boarding school movie and more a thriller. Her boarding house, Tudor House, was located on the very outskirts of the Blackbrook property, farther from the classroom quad than nearly any other building. It was a monument to crumbling glory. Once the property of local logging heiress, it had served time as some kind of girls' reform school earlier in the century before being sold off to Blackbrook for use as one of its fanciest and most coveted girls' dorms. Orchid felt lucky to have been able to claim a room this year. She kicked her boots off in the front hall and headed to the mail stand where the residents' letters had been sorted into little cubby holes. Hey! Scarlet Mystery glimpsed her through the open door to the lounge and came dashing out, much to Orchid's chagrin. The petite Indian girl planted her feet wide and put her hands on her hips. I heard you were just in Body's office. Orchid shrugged and pulled out her mail, a catalog, a college brochure, a letter. Who could be writing her? There was no return address, but the postmark was from the opposite coast. Finn texted me. He said Peacock went ballistic on Body. The resident queen bee of Blackbrook would not be ignored. She flicked the edges of her long, shiny black hair over her shoulder and raised her eyebrows. So what did she say? Orchid ripped open the letter, mostly to have something to do other than gossiping with Scarlet. It was bad enough she had to listen to the other girls hold court at dinner every single night. Finn said he was lucky to be alive, the way that she was screaming and throwing stuff around. It was a single sheet of paper with just 6 typed lines. Found you. You didn't think you could hide from me forever, did you, Emily? Then again, I guess there are still some holes in your security. Hope there's no issue with your finances. I was surprised to see how much they'd let me do. I'm glad you're doing so well in school. Be in touch soon. Orchid heard Scarlet's voice as if from a great distance. Come on, Orchid. You were there. What was it all about? Her mouth was dry, her heart pounded. It seemed like Beth was in big trouble, Orchid said softly. And she wasn't the only one. Chapter 2. Green. The snow went on for 3 days straight, which was not unusual for Rocky Point. All the locals had their salt and snow tires, their stocks of candles and canned goods. When Von Green was 10, a Christmas storm had knocked out the power for more than a week. 2 days into this one, and Headmaster Body didn't so much as delay the 9 a.m. exam start times, which meant the maintenance workers, Vaughn included, were up at 4 a.m. shoveling the walks so that rich students wouldn't get their toes wet on their way to class. He probably should have found a way to get out of it since he'd arrived at his own 9 a.m. music theory exam with an aching back and sweaty pits. Still nailed it, which was why he had been the one to shovel the walks. His grades in music theory were way better than the ones in history, and the history term paper wasn't even finished. Rich kids got things like extensions and excuses. The local scholarship kid had to maintain appearances. But by the 3rd day of snow, even the locals were crying foul, especially because the weather report promised an even more severe ice storm was on the way over the weekend. The governor declared a state of emergency in the area, and half the town decided to evacuate in case the storm surge made the 2-lane road connecting Rocky Point to the mainland impassable. Headmaster Body looked at the situation and finally made the right call. In an email to the entire student body, he announced that all remaining exams would be postponed and the few people left on campus would leave by noon the next day. Only, the storm came one night early, and it was far, far worse than anyone had predicted. Vaughn awoke to the sound of great cracks and booms. The power had gone out at some point in the night, and the chill was beginning to set in, especially around the windows. Vaughn remembered how it had gotten 2 winters ago when the heat had gone off and ice formed several inches thick on the insides of the panes. He couldn't see much in the darkness through the driving sleet, but he guessed the sounds were made by the trees tearing into 2 beneath all the weight of the ice. He was half right. At 6 a.m., their neighbor dropped by to check in on them and reported a few cottages down by the ravine had gotten stove up in the storm. All empty, thank goodness. They probably should have evacuated sooner. Any news from Blackbrook? He asked Vaughn. Everyone in town knew their golden boy. Vaughn shook his head. Ah, said the neighbor. Them from away don't know what they're in for. Vaughn started packing on the layers. His brother looked amused by the plan. Sure, kill yourself trying to get out there. Maybe they'll finally notice you when you're dead. Hard telling not knowing, Vaughn replied. If nothing else, they'll need an extra hand with the sandbags. Oliver snorted. Right. The only thing those Blackbrook kids respect more than a townie is a janitor. Even after all this time, Oliver still hadn't kicked the habit of referring to the other students like that. Those Blackbrook kids. Rich, entitled, mostly useless, and shockingly bad at aiming into urinals. They were Blackbrook, and that meant Vaughn was, well, he didn't really know exactly what he was, not these days, but he'd never forget the day his life changed, the day that he'd gotten his acceptance letter in the mail from Blackbrook Academy. He'd known it was his ticket to a new life. Well, a new half-life at least. Vaughn packed his bag while his brother sat in the old rocker playing with his weapons collection and making snarky comments. Most folks in Rocky Point had at least one gun in their house, and Gemma had taught them both to shoot when they were kids. But Oliver's enthusiasm was as unbridled as it was unsettling, which was precisely how Oliver liked it. Vaughn wasn't in the mood for any of his games. Would it make you feel better to think I'm not going for those Blackbrook kids? Then who? Rusty Naylor, Vaughn said with a shrug. Linda White? Whatever, Oliver sneered. Give my love to Body. I know he's your favorite ass to kiss. Vaughn finished packing and dressing, but before he headed out into the elements, he made one final appeal. Oliver, if I'm not back in 2 days, you think we're keeping to the schedule in this storm? His smile was nearly worse than his sneer. Have fun, I got my own plans. That was never a happy thought. Well, don't do anything stupid. Oh, like trying to cross the ravine in an ice storm? He flipped a vintage tomahawk around in his hand. Maybe they ought to rethink that scholarship of yours. Vaughn knew better than to reply. The scholarship was the best thing that had happened to Oliver in years, too, and he knew it. But his brother wasn't done. He placed the weapon back on the coffee table. Seriously, why do you bother? Vaughn swallowed. Someone has to. For a second, Vaughn thought he might get through, but as always, it was wishful thinking. Oliver was silent. See you then. Alone, he headed out into the storm. It was a little more than a mile from his house to the Blackbrook campus, which stood at the very edge of the point. When the weather was nice, Vaughn would often ride to campus on his bike, but today the roads would be greasy. He grabbed a pair of crampons for what he'd bet would be a painful hike. There were 2 ways to get into Blackbrook. The long way down the old shore row, across the ravine bridge by the old sawmill, and past Cartwright Park and the old Tudor house that marked the very edge of campus. Or the shortcut across the wooded ravine. Both seemed pretty treacherous in this weather. When Vaughn set out, a wintry mist was falling from the sky, stinging his skin with every touch and crackling on the ground like breakfast cereal. That was when Vaughn realized he'd forgotten breakfast. Nothing seemed to matter that morning any more than not getting trapped with Oliver and his plots, which covered the house like a film of grime. His threats, which lay open on every nightstand and behind every door. He could stop for a snack now and risk hypothermia before he reached Blackbrook, or he could press on. Vaughn wrapped his scarf higher around his mouth, pulled his hood farther down around his face, and wished very hard that he'd remembered his baklava. Gemma had never liked them, said they made people look like criminals. Oliver always made the point of wearing his after that. Vaughn only found it funny that people from away, like Gemma, grew up worried about bank robbers more so than their noses freezing off. Between the drifts and the ice, it took Vaughn more than an hour to reach the bridge over the ravine on the main road. Or rather, what was left of the bridge. English wasn't Vaughn's subject, but he was pretty sure there was a metaphor hidden somewhere in the cracked and broken tangle of lumber, rumble, and steel. He should have packed more supplies. No one was getting on or off the Blackbrook campus anytime soon. On the other side of the ravine, he saw the old boathouse, already being buffeted by waves as the storm surged and pushed the tide up the banks. Vaughn turned inland, tracing the path of devastation toward the neighborhood overlooking the ravine. Several times he heard thunderous crashes in the trees, echoing from rock to rock and drowning out the storm's cackling hush. Several times he broke into a sprint as the branches above him creaked and moaned beneath the growing weight of ice. This wasn't like the storms he'd grown up with. Snowstorms would muffle sounds, creating drifts of silence Vaughn had always thought you could get lost in. He'd once heard a song about a man who'd gone walking in a silent wood only to slip into an enchanted world. But when Vaughn finally came to a break in the trees where the wood gave away to the ravine road, he realized this was no fairyland. It was hell. Once the home of lumber workers before the mill had shut down, the ravine cottages had seen better days. Porches tilted into the valley, and paint was more of a suggestion than a promise. Vaughn and his brother had been born in one of those cottages. That one over there with the faded green door. That one that currently lay in a mangled wreck at the bottom of the ravine. A few of the cottages got stove up. Typical Maine understatement. Half of the homes here had been utterly obliterated. The road was a mess of roof tiles and splintered clapboard, and as Vaughn picked his way through the wreckage, he could barely differentiate between sheets of ice and scattered shards of window panes. He spared one last glance at the house with the faded green door, and for just a moment he remembered Gemma's face, pale and sunken as it had been on the morning he'd found her. Be glad she didn't live to see this. That was the echo of Oliver in his head. The house that had ceased being a home long before Gemma's death, and she wouldn't have even remembered it near the end. She'd remembered so little, after all. Just her grievances. He saw a flash of color against the gray and the black of the storm. Another person out here in this weather, picking her way through the rubble. Town this size, you basically knew everyone by their parkers. This was old Mrs. Douglas from the post office. He waved and she gave him a Yankee nod. Vaughn? The woman's voice echoed across the ravine. She had a 50-50 shot. She gestured up the slope. Is the old footbridge still good? For another few minutes till the storm surge comes in. Don't tell me you're going to try to make it up to Blackbrook. You'll get trapped out there. I'm sure they wouldn't mind if you miss a class just this once. Better out there than in the house with his brother. There's no class, ma'am, he explained. I just want to make sure that the Flatlanders come through the storm all right. Even through the layers of scarf over his features, he could see the face she made. Well, good luck to you. She sounded like Oliver when she said that. As though if he cast his lot with the Blackbrook folks, she'd wash her hands of the whole matter. If he slipped on the bridge over the ravine and fell to his death, well, that was his choice too. That was how it went with those from Rocky Point and their fraught relationship with the school. Since the mill had closed, almost everyone in town made their living off of Blackbrook in one way or another, but that didn't mean they had to like it. Vaughn had long ago gotten used to the contradiction. All of his neighbors bursting with pride that he was a Blackbrook kid, even as they spat the term at other students at the school. Near the top of the ravine was an old handmade footbridge sticking out from the side of the rock. The ice lay thick on its surface, and the drop down the bluff beneath it, splintered boards, was steep and slippery. He could hear Oliver now. Are you numb, risking your life for those Blackbrook kids? But it wasn't for them. It had never been for them. It was for Vaughn. He put a foot on the bridge. It creaked and shuddered, but it always did that, even when they'd been kids and Oliver had dared him to cross that very, very first time. Vaughn had never been the daredevil in the family. Every risk they had ever taken, it had been Oliver forcing his hand. He took a step, and then another. The ice crackled and shattered beneath him. The woods trickled around him. He wondered if Mrs. Douglas was watching him. He wondered if they'd find his body at the bottom of the ravine. And then, when he wondered how things were at Blackbrook, he took another tentative step. His boots slid out from under him. He grabbed for the rock as he went down, gloved fingers scraping uselessly against the stone. The crampons finally pierced to the surface and stopped his slide, and he righted himself, his balance all askew beneath the weight of his pack. One more step and he'd be safe. Whew, there, he made it. He looked back across the ravine, seeking out the form of Mrs. Douglas in her bright coat, but she was already gone. Figured. Vaughn pressed on. It took another hour for the high gabled roofs of Tudor House marking the edge of the Blackbrook campus to come into view, and by that time Vaughn had lost all feeling in his fingers and toes. He remembered learning that victims of hyperthermia imagined that they were too hot right before the end, and so he took that as a good sign, as he'd never been so cold in his life. Tudor House looked dark and empty from the outside, but the power was probably off there too. He knew Mrs. White would not have left. Vaughn struggled up the marble steps to the porch, the spikes of his boots probably leaving nice long gashes in the stone, and knocked on the lion head knocker on the ornate front door. After a moment, a girl answered. Her skin had the pale, nearly translucent cast most people got around here when the days grew short. Her hair was a muddy brown and aggressively brushed into a short, bushy bob. Her long bangs and square-rimmed glasses nearly hid her shockingly deep blue eyes, which widened as she saw him. Vaughn? She asked. You must be freezing. Get inside. He obeyed. Though I don't know how warm it is in here, the girl went on, closing the door. At once the sound of the wind and the ice ceased, and Vaughn nearly gasped from relief. It was dim in the hall, but not dark, as the light came on from a tall window over the door. In the gloom, one might still imagine Tudor House looking as it had a century ago, in its glossy, Gilded Age glory. The power went out last night. Rusty's working on the generator. She looked up at him. Are you okay? You're not frozen, are you? It's a little nippy out there. She was very pretty, this girl in the nice warm hallway where he'd found himself. She wore an enormous sweater, one that looked like it'd been knit for a linebacker, over a pair of fleece leggings and giant poofy slippers. Orchid, he tried as he pulled off his gloves and hat. He was famously terrible with names, but that one had stuck. Yeah, she nodded. From history class? Sorry, he said, unwrapping his scarf. He was used to apologizing for forgetting people's names and letting people come up with their own reasons why. I'm so cold. Of course, she took him by the arm. Come sit by the fire we've got going in the lounge. Mrs. White made a stew. He let himself be led into the lounge, where there was, as promised, a most marvelous fire. There was also another girl there, curled up under what he knew was one of Mrs. White's handmade crazy quilts. This girl he knew too, Scarlet Mystery. Junior class president, all-around superstar, rich witch. As Oliver would say, the most Blackbrook kid in the entire school. Scarlet narrowed her eyes in his direction as he took off the coat and got closer to the flames. Von Green, she sneered. What are you doing here? And now we're up to about 30 minutes for this video and the end of chapter 2. So we're gonna wrap it up for today. And our next video will resume with chapter 3 from Scarlet's point of view. So I hope you have enjoyed our story so far and you've enjoyed the art created by the VolunTeens, and we will see you hopefully next time. Thanks.